Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Strife in Syria and the Threat to Syrian Druze. I'm Jonathan Rui, JINSA's Director of Foreign Policy. I'm pleased to be joined today by a broad-based panel that will cover Druze, Israeli, and American perspectives surrounding recent events that occurred in the Suwayda province of southern Syria. Before we begin, I want to flag for everyone that JINSA has a forthcoming report on many of the issues we'll be discussing here today and on U.S. policy towards Syria going forward. Please keep your eyes peeled for that paper from JINSA next week. By quick way of background, the Druze are a religious minority community native to Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, some 700,000 of whom reside in Syria out of a total global population of roughly 1 million. In Syria, Druze are concentrated primarily in the southern Suwayda governorate. Earlier this month, Bedouin tribal gunmen ambushed a Druze merchant on the highway from Damascus to Suwayda, which escalated further into widespread sectarian clashes and brief Israeli military intervention before a tenuous ceasefire took hold last week. To discuss these recent events and their implications, I'm pleased to be joined today first by retired IDF General Yaakov Amidror, who is a distinguished fellow. He was formerly Israel's national security advisor. Alex Makled is managing director at Accenture and an outspoken advocate for the Syrian Druze community. He also holds positions in the American Druze Society and the Jabal al-Rayyan Foundation. Andrew Tabler is the Martin J. Gross Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Previously, he served as senior advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria Engagement, and before that, as the director for Syria at the National Security Council, among many other positions. At the outset of today's webinar, we have a video message that's been recorded specifically for today's event by IDF Major General Elian, who is the head of Kogat, Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories. Among other things, Kogat oversees Israeli civilian policy in the West Bank, and it facilitates coordination between Israel and Gaza. Nolan, if you would please play for our audience the introductory video from the Kogat director.
We don't hear. I don't know if you hear him. We don't hear him.
Nolan, can we get sound on that? So his video is recorded in Hebrew with subtitles in English, just for everyone watching.
שמי רסן עליאן, אני גר בשפרעם, יישוב בצפון, נשוי ואבא לשלושה בנים. גדלתי, התחנכתי במקום שיש פה 3 עדות, גם דרוזים, גם נוצרים, גם מוסלמים, ואפילו עד שנת 52 היו משפחות יהודיות בתוך העיר שפרעם. גדלתי, התחנכתי שם בבית ספר, התגייסתי לצבא בשנת 90. עשיתי מסלול צבאי כלוחם בחטיבת גולני, והיום אני כמתאם פעולות הממשלה בשטחים. מסלול צבאי ארוך מאוד, היום אני סוגר גם 35 שנה בצבא. מבחינתי המסלול הצבאי שלי, שאני מסכם את התקופה, מסלול מאוד מאוד משמעותי, עם השפעה מאוד גדולה על הרבה מאוד אנשים, והרבה מאוד עדות שמתגייסות לצבא, וזה לא משנה בהיותי קצין דרוזי או לא, אני קצין בצה"ל, ושהדבר המרכזי מבחינתי זה הגנה על ביטחונה של מדינת ישראל, וכלל התפקידים הכווינו אותי לתוך המטרה הזאת. אני אתן לכם קצת רקע על הדרוזים בתוך ישראל, אבל אני רוצה שנייה אחת לתת לכם תמונה איפה נמצאים הדרוזים במזרח התיכון, בעולם בכלל. כאשר הקהילה המרכזית יושבת במזרח התיכון, האוכלוסייה הגדולה ביותר יושבת בסוריה, אחריה בלבנון, בסוריה יושבת בעיקר בהר הדרוזים ועוד קצת ליד דמשק, ובלבנון יושבים בעיקר בהרי השוף, במקומות מאוד מאוד גבוהים, ובמדינת ישראל יש קרוב ל-130,000 דרוזים שנמצאים בעיקר בצפון, במרחב של הגליל התחתון והגליל העליון, ויש עוד 4 כפרים דרוזים ברמת הגולן, שנשארו אחרי כיבוש רמת הגולן, נשארו 4 הכפרים, והם חיים כאזרחים במדינת ישראל. ומכאן אני רוצה להיכנס לדרוזים והקשר שלהם עם מדינת ישראל, שבעיניי יש פה אירוע מרתק. הדרוזים חיים פה מאות שנים, המשפחה שלי חיה פה מאות שנים בגליל, ובעצם עם תחילתו של היישוב היהודי בשנות ה-30 וה-40 של המאה הקודמת. בתוך הדבר הזה אני בא ממשפחה שסבא שלי היה ממקימי הקשר שנוצר בשנות ה-30 עם היישוב היהודי, עם הדמויות המרכזיות ביישוב היהודי באותה תקופה. לקח חלק בקרבות של כיבוש הגליל ובכלל. ובאותה תקופה ההנהגה של הנהגת הדרוזים קיבלה החלטה אסטרטגית שהיא בעצם מלווה אותנו עד היום הזה, שהקשר של מיעוט מאוד מאוד קטן עם היישוב היהודי, שזה העתיד שלה, ככה הם רואים את עצמם. ובעצם הדבר הזה מלווה אותנו עד היום. כמו שאמרתי, הקשר המשפחתי הזה, וזה שגדלתי בבית שסבא שלי אף זכה בעיטור לוחמי המדינה, לכל הלוחמים שלקחו חלק בהקמת מדינת ישראל, אני חושב שהדבר הזה נתן לי את הכיוון, וידעתי לאן אני הולך. אני בא ממשפחה של לוחמים, שכולנו התגייסנו לצבא, נלחמנו את מלחמות ישראל, ואנחנו ממשיכים עד היום הזה. ובעצם אני מייצג אומנם את עצמי, אבל אני חושב שיש עוד הרבה מאוד צעירים כמוני, יש מאות ואלפי חיילים דרוזים בתוך צה"ל, בכלל היחידות, בין אם זה טייסים, בין אם זה יחידות מיוחדות. בכל מקום היום אתה יכול למצוא את החיילים הדרוזים, רואים את עצמם חלק בלתי נפרד, בוודאי מצה"ל, רואים את עצמם חלק בלתי נפרד ממדינת ישראל, מהאוכלוסייה הישראלית. מכאן אני רוצה לעבור לדבר העיקרי העיקרי שאני חושב שמתרחש בעצם בשבועות האחרונים, אבל השיא שלו היה בשבוע שעבר, ב-12 וה-13 ליולי. אוכלוסייה הדרוזית בסוריה חווה אירוע מאוד מאוד מורכב. כמובן אחרי הנפילה של אסד, עליית המשטר החדש של שארעה, הדרוזים חוו לפני כמעט 1.5 חודשים אירוע מאוד משמעותי של התנכלות ושל התקפות הולכות ונשנות במרחב של דמשק, אם זה בג'רמנה, באשרפי סכניה, ושם אנחנו מצאנו את עצמנו כמדינת ישראל במחויבות מאוד מאוד גבוהה להגן על האוכלוסייה. ולפני שבוע וחצי, האוכלוסייה הדרוזית בהר הדרוזים, שזה נמצא בדרום רמת הגולן, על גבול ירדן סוריה. המרחב הזה לאורך ההיסטוריה, הדרוזים חיו שם, בתוך מרחב סווידה, שהוא מורכב מעיר מאוד מאוד גדולה ופרפרים כפריים שמונים פחות או יותר כ-700,000 אנשים, שומרים על עצמם, שומרים על הדת, שומרים על מאפיין ותרבות ומסורת. הדרוזים חיים שם מאות שנים. הדבר הזה המשיך עד ההפיכה שהייתה בסוריה, והגיע שארעה עם האנשים שלו, והדרוזים, בהר הדרוזים הסתכלו על המשטר החדש כמשטר איסלאמיסטי, משטר שהוא מושתת על טרור לאורך השנים האחרונות, והוא לא היה מוכן לקבל את המרות של המשטר החדש, כי המשטר רצה לבסס את השלטון שלו על חוקה אסלאמית, שרעית, והדבר הזה נוגד התפיסה של הדרוזים, לא רק בסוריה, אלא בכל מקום, להשתלב בתוך המדינה לפי חוקה, לפי דמוקרטיה, חופש הדת, ובכלל חופש כבני אדם. והדבר הזה לא השתלב עם התפיסה של המשטר החדש בתוך סוריה. ולפני שבוע גם כוחות המשטר וגם כוחות אל-עשאיר, הכוחות הבדואים שנמצאים במרחב הדרומי של סוריה, עם קבוצות אסלאמיסטיות, דאעש ואחרים, בהתקפה חסרת רחמים על האוכלוסייה הדרוזית בסווידה ובמרחבים הכפריים. אנחנו מדברים על השביעי לעשירי של סווידה, אירוע שרצחו אנשים, אנסו נשים, רצחו תינוקות, לקחו אנשים וחטפו אנשים לשבי, חסמו וצרו על המרחב הזה של סווידה לאורך כמה ימים. המראות מראות מאוד מאוד קשים. אוכלוסייה שצריכה להגן על עצמה, אבל מול התקפה רחבה מאוד, עם הרבה מאוד אנשים, שגם ללא רחמים, עם תמונות ומראות מאוד מאוד קשים. מצאת עצמה האוכלוסייה הדרוזית מוגנת אך ורק על ידי מדינת ישראל, והקשר של מדינת ישראל עם המרחב הזה של סווידה, או עם הדרוזים של סוריה, הוא מושתת על הקשר של הדרוזים בארץ למול מדינת ישראל, ובכך מדינת ישראל ראתה את הדרוזים בסוריה כחלק מהאחים של הדרוזים במדינת ישראל, וכך יצאה להגנתם ועשתה פעולות רחבות מאוד בשביל לעצור את ההתקפה חסרת הרחמים על הסורים. ובעצם היום אנחנו נמצאים בימים של הפסקת אש, שהיא מחזיקה מעמד כבר שבוע וחצי, אבל המצור על סווידה עדיין קיים. חוסר היכולת להכניס סיוע הומניטרי לתוך סווידה ולתוך הכפרים, לצערי הרב, הולך בקושי רב. מדינת ישראל מבצעת הרבה מאוד פעולות לסיוע לאוכלוסייה הדרוזית, גם בסווידה וגם ברמת הגולן, הכפרים של החרמון, בין אם זה טיפול רפואי, כולל הכנסת מטופלים לתוך מדינת ישראל, הקמת מרפאות במרחב של רמת הגולן שיכולה לקלוט פצועים וחולים, ואנחנו עושים היום מאמצים רחבים מאוד בשביל לתת סיוע לדרוזים, בין אם זה סיוע הומניטרי ובכלל לאלה שנמצאים בסווידה. אני רוצה פה באמת לנצל את ההזדמנות ולדבר על לא פחות מטבח שקרה לאוכלוסייה. אנחנו מדברים, אין לנו עדיין מספר מדויק להגיד כמה אנשים נהרגו, אבל המראות מראות מאוד מאוד קשים, שעדיין הבדואים מחזיקים בלא מעט שבויים, גם אזרחים וגם לוחמים. והדבר הזה אני חושב שלא הביא, לא לצעקה של העולם. אני פשוט רואה את ההתעניינות של העולם כמעט ולא קיימת בתוך המרחב הזה, שלא נדבר על זה שחלק גדול מהעולם הופתע מההתקפה הזאת על המרחב של סווידה, הוא הופתע בכלל מה זה האוכלוסייה הדרוזית שנמצאת שם, ומה מקור הסכסוך הזה שנמצא בתוך המרחב הזה. ולכן חשוב לי מאוד בשיחה הזאת גם להביא לידיעת אנשים ששומעים אותי כרגע, שיש פה מיעוט מאוד מאוד קטן, שאני חושב שיכול להיות חשוף לתוקפנות דומה מאוד בעתיד, ולכן צריך לעשות הכל בשביל לעצור את הדבר הזה. ועדיין המחויבות של מדינת ישראל, גם ביטחונית, גם אזרחית, לאוכלוסייה שנמצאת שם. אנחנו לא מתכוונים שהאוכלוסייה הזאת תהפוך לאוכלוסייה ישראלית מחר בבוקר, אבל האוכלוסייה הזאת צריכה לקבל הגנה ככל האפשר ממדינת ישראל, ואנחנו בציפייה שהמשטר החדש בסוריה ייקח אחריות על כל האוכלוסייה שלו, וימצא את הדרך לשלב לא רק האוכלוסייה הדרוזית, אלא גם האוכלוסייה הנוצרית, האוכלוסייה העלווית והקורדית בתוך המרחב הזה, תחת חוקה אחת שמתאימה לכלל האוכלוסיות בתוך סוריה.
Wonderful. Well, I think General Elian's video did a good job of setting the table and giving us plenty of context in which to open up a discussion. Before I start asking our panelists questions, just a reminder to our audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please just type them into the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to them in the time that we have. So, Alex, I'd like to start with you. Let's start at the beginning, start at the most local level here. So I think we got some interesting context in that video about some of the events that happened. But could you start by giving our audience just sort of a basic sense of, more generally, what we know the initial precursor, the Bedouin attack on the highway, but what led up to this event? How did we get to this point more generally? Because I think this is a new issue of discussion for a lot of our audience here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, Blaze, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to express my views on what really took place. It goes back. This is not something just happened overnight. This started really in the early 2010, 2011, when the population of Syria, or most of them, revolted against the Assad regime, and they created all these different factions trying to obviously remove him. And the Druze minority at the time decided to stay neutral in that war. What they did is stopped letting their young men serve in the Assad regime, because they didn't believe that Syrians should be killing other Syrians. So they removed themselves from that civil war, if you would, until the last 2-3 years, when they became more active in speaking up against the Assad regime, because they felt and they knew that situation was non-sustainable economically, from many different angles. So they did take a stand against the Assad regime in a very peaceful way. And then obviously we all know the Assad regime was removed in December, and the Druze were actually one of the first groups that went down to Damascus to find a way to cooperate and work with this new transitional government. And they sent many delegations to see if there's a way they could work with that group. And obviously nothing really of substance that took place. They went back and forth, and immediately they start seeing very bad signs that this new transitional government has its own ideology, has its own vision, and has its own way of running that country, which does not include minorities, especially the Druze. And we have obviously very factual evidence that's exactly what took place, because they did extend their hand to see if they can build a country that's democratic, that's free, that's civilized, that's futuristic, and none of that took place. So with the Druze there, and since I have family there, they start seeing real bad signs when other minorities start getting attacked. The Alawites, obviously we know the situation with the Kurds, and the Druze start having problems actually connecting and coming to Damascus for their daily lives, right? So the road between Damascus and Suwayda became very dangerous. Kidnapping, killing, stealing by the transitional government subgroups, even though on the surface they deny that, but subsurface we have evidence those folks are supported, are actually motivated for a bigger situation than the Druze in terms of cleansing and extermination of minorities and so on and so on. So it started way back. It became very obvious to us in the last 2-3 months. And the Bedouin incident was just a trigger or a spark, really, that they were ready for it. And their entire goal is total extermination of minorities, including the Druze, and running Syria in a totally different ideology. And their vision and ideology goes beyond Syria, beyond the Druze and more. So that's kind of what the backdrop of this. So I'm happy to get into specifics as needed, but just to give you a little bit of where all of this started.
Thank you, Alex. General Amador, I'll turn to you next. So as we've heard, Israel intervened with airstrikes against government forces. And so I want to use that as a context to ask you, since the Assad regime fell late last year, we've heard, at least my understanding is Israel's primary goal as it relates to Syria and that side of the Golan Heights was to ensure that no malign actors, filled the vacuum there so they could pose a threat to Israeli borders. Now it seems, is it fair to say, did Israel get involved because it worried that the events of earlier this month pose that kind of threat, that this is a way to government forces trying to fill that vacuum in a dangerous way along the border? Or does this represent something broader, an Israeli goal as it relates to the Druze community and perhaps something more ambitious like that?
Look, Israel does not have how to say it, the Israel should not intervene in the Syrian mass situation. That was the decision when the war against the Assad regime began years ago, 2011, and that should be the decision in the future. There are few exceptions. First is Israel interest. We don't want any military forces, terrorists, and so on to control or to be in a position to attack Israel from the south part of Syria. And for that, we are very determined not to let any of these forces to take hold in the south of Damascus. We did it during Assad's regime, and we will do it during this regime. We will not let anyone to build a situation in which the south part of Syria is the launching pad for the next friction with Israel. This is first and clear. By the way, we made it clear to the Syrian regime and to the Turks, and it is known in both in Damascus and in Turkey. There is the second exception are the Druze. We have commitment because of our relations with the Druze in Israel not to let the regime to use its superiority relating to this minority of the Druze in the east part of Dera and in some villages south of Damascus and east to the Israeli line in the Golan Heights. In the area that we moved to the east, now we are controlling some new Druze villages, and and Israel is very determined not to let the regime in Syria to slaughter the Druze. We have to remember that it is more complicated than just the extremism of this regime in Damascus. The Sunnis were the majority in Syria, which was controlled by the Alawites and other minorities, including the Druze, which were part of the Assad regime system, till they decided that Assad regime is too weak and they didn't want to be identified with the Assad regime. And when the Sunnis came back to control Syria, and they are, I don't know, probably 85% of the population, they are taking revenge. And what they did to the Alawites is not connected at all to the fact that they are Islamist or extremist or Daesh or whatever. There are memories about the way that they had been treated by Assad regime during the years, and how the Assad regime butchered the Sunnis. If in Syria today there are, out of 18 million people, that was the number of the population of Syria before the war, 12 million are refugees, 6 inside Syria and 6 outside Syria. That was before the change in the regime. Probably 90% of them are Sunnis. You will not find many refugees within the Alawites, the Druze, or the Christians, or the Kurds. You will find that probably 90 or 95% of the refugees are either inside Syria or outside Syria, are Sunnis. Out of the number is not known, but everyone is speaking about 600,000 people killed during the war in Syria. Probably, again, 90% are Sunni, and very few are from the minority side of the Syrian society. So it is more complicated. It's not just that the new regime origin and roots is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It is something about the situation inside Syria and the relations between the majority and the minorities.
Mm-hmm.
This is why it is much more complicated. In spite of all these explanations that you can get from experts to the Syrian society, because of the commitment that we have to the Druze, we decided to intervene. And the strong reaction which we took, including bombing inside Damascus, the headquarters of the military part of the new regime, was because we had kind of understanding with the new regime that they will not send military forces into the south. Mm-hmm. And when we understood that they are sending tanks and other military carriers into the Druze area, we decided to tell them, or to signal to them, guys, it was against what was understood between us. And it was very important to put the red line that the regime understands that the red lines that Israel will not let it cross. Mm-hmm. We continue the negotiations with the Syrians under the table in some places, including Azerbaijan, which volunteered to host the dialogue. And from our point of view, we want to give the regime the opportunity to show that, in spite of the fact that they are coming from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, at least they claim that they changed their attitude and they supposed to behave like more, how to say, normal people, and not to use the opportunity to butcher the minorities. It is one part of our negotiation. We took some very strong measures at the beginning. We moved the line between us and the Syrian forces 10 kilometers east of the old line, including the peak of the Hermon mountain. We destroyed probably 80 or 90% of all the hardware of the old Assad regime army, so they cannot take those carriers and tanks and so on, and to build their own army. And as I said, we are signaling them again and again that we will not let any military forces to be in the south. We agreed that kind of police forces will come in to stand between the Druze and the Bedouin in the south. Both groups have weapons and they have long history of friction between themselves. And Israel cannot solve all the problem of the Syrian society.
Joe, I'll pause there because I think that brings us up to a good. We've gotten the Druze and Israeli. Now I want to go to the American perspective of, how we got to where we are now, and then we'll go forward from there. So Andrew, thank you. I'd like to sort of pose the question to you because I can think of few people better to ask. I guess if you could start just sort of level set, what was U.S. policy toward the new regime in Syria? Let's say up until the events we're now discussing, and then has that at all changed in the wake of what's happened in Suwayda?
Yeah. First of all, it's great to be with you all and be joining this discussion. So, in here I'm summarizing the last 6 to 8 months, but the Assad regime came down in the early part of December, quite dramatically, as I think many of you remember. And that was due in no small part to the policies of the Assad regime, but also an extensive American sanctions regime that was put on to the Assad regime, designed to drain it of resources and hold it accountable for atrocities that were being committed which had been committed inside of the country during the war and even up, and then subsequently. Regime came down, caught the Biden administration quite off guard. Their policy was to sort of give the Assad regime a lot of rope. Israel also had a different policy during that time. They were looking at the possibility of the Assad regime, reconstituting or holding on or whatever. Anyways, all that went out the window. Didn't really matter anymore. We suddenly had to deal with a new reality. Biden administration was pretty reluctant. I think it was twofold. One, everybody who has a brain and a heart can look at that war and all the suffering that General Amador talked about, as well as Alex, and understand that these people, after all these years of war and suffering and slaughter and torture, deserve a chance to rebuild and to go in a different direction. And so there was a general license that was issued, General License 24, that allowed for a sort of modest, moderate suspension of sanctions or allowing of aid and other kinds of material into Syria. But it was when the Trump administration took over, I think that Syria was not important. President Trump said that pretty directly. He said, we're not going to be, actually, even before he took office, we're not going to be intervening in Syria. We're not going to be doing anything in Syria. So the administration focused on other things, Iran's nuclear program, Gaza, a whole host of other things. But as always, Syria has a way of creating attention when you least want it to. And so as the Sharaa government constituted itself in Damascus, there were real concerns about it in U.S. policy circles, as well as those in the region, some of which we mentioned have to do with its Salafist jihadist origins. That's not a mystery to anyone. And of course, there is the issue of Sunni revenge. That's got to be a natural tendency. It's hard enough to control your troops when you're in a forward area. I can only imagine after all those years of suffering, trying to control those forces. But I think the thing that became very worrisome was that there was a indication very early on from Ahmed Sharaa in his circle that he did not want to share power with anyone, and that became a problem as the central government in Damascus, the transitional government, tried to reassert its control over the country. Now, there was a previous American approach, put about 8 different points reportedly in front of the Sharaa government, which they answered, and then there was a series of questions back and forth. And these dealt with a wide variety of issues concerning their relationship, even their posture concerning Israel, the fight against ISIS, the detainees in eastern Syria, expelling Palestinian extremists and militants from Syrian territory, which had been there for decades, and of course chemical weapons, and so these issues were put in front of Damascus, and there was early on, up until May 13th, when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, there was a policy of engagement with Damascus in return for conditional sanctions relief, and it was all sort of staked out and was ready to be unfolded. President Trump changed that on May 13th in Saudi Arabia, and that he wanted Syria to have a chance to shine, as he talked about, and to go in a different direction, which was the original sentiment, I think, of a lot of Americans at the end when the Assad regime collapsed, that Syria did deserve a chance to shine. Then what happened is that President Trump ordered a cessation of all sanctions on Syria, and Syria had some of the world's most complex and thick sanctions as a result of years of being on a state sponsor list of terrorism, and also, most importantly, Caesar sanctions, named after the regime photographer, which smuggled images out of Syria during the Assad regime, depicting severe mutilation of bodies and torture. So these have secondary sanctions effects, and so those sanctions, in particular Caesar sanctions, were standing in the way of investment by Gulf countries and other countries in Syria to rebuild. So very quickly, bureaucracy adjusted. They issued an executive order on June 30th of this year, and that repeals large swaths of previous executive orders that were in place, and also suspends other aspects of U.S. sanctions. It's too much to go into at this discussion, but 2 of them in particular, state sponsor of terrorism, but also the Caesar sanctions, remain U.S. law as a result of them being produced by Congress and passed by Congress. So those remained in place, but the intent of President Trump was the cessation and the lifting of sanctions to allow for investment inside of Syria. That effort has continued to unfold, and U.S. envoy Barak has led the way on that, both in the U.S. government, but also recently at the United Nations to lift sanctions on Syria. And I think it was an actual very earnest attempt to go in a completely different direction, to do something that no one had ever dreamed of, right? I think the problem remained, though, is that the Sharaa government was having a problem dealing with minority-dominated areas of Syria. So in areas that are Sunni majority or dominated, it's a little bit less of an issue because the sectarian issue is not as high. Also, military groups in those areas were being brought into the Syrian military in whole cloth. So whole divisions with commanders were being brought into the Syrian military, putting on new insignia and showing up for duty. With the minority-dominated areas, particularly with Jebel Druze, but also out in eastern Syria with the Kurds, they were being asked instead in a process to join as individuals, not whole cloth divisions, and not with their own commanders. And this caused, amongst other things, I think, a lot of concern among these minorities, in particular because, like during the Mandate period, going way back before the Second World War, these communities were used to self-rule in large part, and the attempt of the central government to assert its authority was really in question, especially after all these years of civil war. So we saw the events unfold in Suwayda. Our guests on my colleagues here know much more about it because a lot of the suffering and the shooting happened in southern Syria, as they both talked about. I'll say a couple of things from the U.S. standpoint. U.S. policy is pretty clear that there is, as Tom Barak talked about, there is no plan B in Syria, right? There is the Sharaa government. So I don't think this is about regime change. I don't think this is, certainly not, and certainly not about nation building. They've been very clear about that. But I do think that that what the U.S. seeks is to have a stable and viable government in Damascus that's able to reconstitute and control its territory. And to that end, what we saw just in Suwayda, both with the deployment of Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior forces, but also some sort of hooligans fighting alongside of them, some of which the Sharaa government openly talks about, has raised questions about the capacity of the Sharaa to move beyond a more narrow sectarian base around former HTS Corps and so on, and towards a more larger national army that would represent the interests of Syrians and cut the kind of political deals that make domination like we saw, or the movement or the events that we saw in Suwayda, not necessary, where you can cut a political deal and have a political process. And unfortunately in Syria, we don't have that. And because of that, because of the violence, because of the tension and the lack of a viable political process to date, this is causing risk to go up. And ultimately, I'm sorry to say, will probably get in the way of the ability of outside parties to finance Syria's reconstruction in a way that benefits Syrians rapidly and comprehensively. And instead, we're going to have a very messy situation going forward.
Thank you, Andrew. That was that very helpfully covered several of my anticipated several of my next questions as well. So let's build off that. So as Andrew mentioned, let's adopt his skepticism about the Sharaa government's ability to to lead a workable solution here that incorporates a lot of Syria's various communities. So I'll use that as a jumping off point. Alex, I'll ask you first, and then I'll turn to General Amadrour. I'm going to sort of bundle a couple questions from our audience together at once here. So, Alex, would the Druze in Syria consider moving to Israel? And as a second part, say if not, would it be possible, and Alex, asking from your perspective here, would it be possible for Israel to arm the Druze in the similar fashion that Israel armed its partners in the southern Lebanese army decades ago?
Well, let's take them one at a time here. Would the Druze consider moving and becoming part of Israel? The Druze, really, what they're really looking for now is peace, is freedom, is democracy, is a future for their families, for their kids, for their brothers and sisters, actually around the region. So either in Druze, Israel are very close to the Druze in Suwayda, the Druze in Suwayda very close to the Druze in Lebanon. And their main goal in life is, you guys leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. We have never really attacked any other factions anywhere in the world. If we're part of Israel, we love Israel. If we're part of Syria and Syria is treating us fairly like everybody else, we love Syria. If we're part of Lebanon and Lebanon is treating us fairly like everybody else, we love Lebanon. So they're very peaceful people. They're very attached to their land and they're very attached to their families. So whoever gives them that opportunity, they will go with. If it's Israel, it's Israel. If it's Syria under a different government, under a different system, under a different ideology, under a different vision, it's Syria. If it's Jordan, it's Jordan. So that's really what they're looking for: freedom, peace, democracy. And if I have to evaluate the situation now and their options, really, Israel is their best option. From an American perspective, sitting here for the last 35 years and watching what's going on in that region, even under the Assad regime and his dad, right? The Druze, yes, they lived in peace and they lived in somewhat prosperity, but that's not because of the Assad and his system. It was because of the Druze themselves and their love for their land and agriculture, and their Druze sons really around the world, providing them with ways to live. Okay. So if you evaluate the situation now, and me talking to the local leadership there in Suwayda, and I'm not concerned saying it. I think Israel provides them with the best opportunity at this point of time, because we have seen how our brothers and sisters in Israel have been treated and how they contributed to the growth and prosperity and stability of Israel, and we think we can do the same thing. So that's how I would really approach that. Now, if Syria, which is very unlikely, overnight changes the system and they share in power and they become an inclusive, prosperous, civilized, free, democratic society, I have to tell you that most Druze would probably prefer to stay there because of their history and because how the Druze back in 1925 led the process really to allow Syria to become independent of the French at the time. But I'm skeptical of this government in Syria. I don't think they know how to lead. I don't think they understand what democracy is. I don't think they know what freedom is. I don't think they know what women rights are. I don't think they know how you can live in peace and prosperity and share power and depend on people. So I'm very skeptical from that perspective. I don't think Jordan has the ability to absorb the Druze for many, many reasons. So I hope and pray that the Druze get an opportunity to become either independent or part of a civilized, futuristic country that could leverage their resources, not only human resources, but natural resources, and really create a stable cornerstone in that region with the Druze as a major part of that. Now, what was the second question there, please? I think.
Well, sort of, I guess, if the Druze, if staying in Syria is the option, with all the caveats you mentioned about wanting to be peacefully integrated in the country, the sort of the Southern Lebanese army option, the acceptance of not just Israeli military intervention against government forces, but even direct supplies of arms.
Yeah, again, that could be a solution, but I'm not sure it's really an optimum solution. Again, Druze like to belong and they like to be part of a bigger country that has again futuristic visions, and it may be an interim solution, but in the long run, I'm not sure that's really the way to go. And reflecting back again for the last 6-8 decades, the Druze in Syria and in Lebanon, obviously, they struggled really because they're a small minority in the sea of ideology that's totally different. And so it may be an interim solution, but not a long-term solution for the Druze.
Thank you. So General Amadror, just very quickly, if I could get your thoughts, sort of the Israeli counterpart to what I asked Alex, what are, other than the red lines you mentioned toward the Syrian government in Damascus, are there Israeli policy options under consideration or that you would think of in terms of direct relationship with the Druze, either supporting them directly in Syria or encouraging even relocation to Israel's Druze communities? Oh, and you're still on mute, General.
I don't think that relocation to Israel is an option that the Druze will like, or it is good for the Druze minorities around the Middle East. Remember that there are Druze in Lebanon as well. I think it will be a mistake. The Druze should defend themselves in the Jabal Druze east of Dera. We can support them. We cannot do the job for them. And they know that they can get help from Israel if situation will deteriorate. And I think it's what is very important for them at the moment. I believe that in our conversations and dialogues with the regime in Damascus, we can make them understand our red lines, and that will help the Druze very much, because it will be well understood that the Druze ability to defend themselves is part of our interest. And I think that should be solved within the new Syrian state and not by forces which will be sent by Israel. Israel can help, but Israel cannot make the job.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, General. And just very, very quickly, one follow-up question. I believe Israeli officials and Syrian officials are continuing to meet with discuss issues. We've also heard, before recent events that we're discussing here, there was talk, at least at high levels, of potential an Israeli-Syrian agreement, maybe not normalization, but something less ambitious, a non-aggression pact or an armistice, call it what you want. Did you lend much credence to those discussions before these recent events? And if so, have you changed that view since?
No, I think that we should continue to speak with the regime in Syria. It is a very important country in the Levant. It is a key for keeping Hezbollah under pressure and not letting the Iranians to reconnect their directly through the land with Hezbollah. So I think it's too important state not to try, at least to see if we can come to an arrangement which will keep the area quiet without a war, and will secure the existence and the ability of the Druze to defend themselves and to flourish in the areas in which they are located. So my view is that we should continue these conversations with the Syrians. The red lines of Israel should be well understood on the other side, and I believe that if that will be the situation and Israel clarify its red lines, it will help the Druze. It will help us to save our interests as well.
Thank you, General. So Andrew, I'll turn back to you in the couple of minutes we have left, and we'll sort of pull back as far as we can go on the perspective here. So I guess going forward, you talked about sort of the U.S. position toward Syria, but more broadly, since the Assad regime fell, we've seen all sorts of other Western, but also America's Arab partner governments, either making high-profile visits to Damascus, or doing a lot of diplomatic engagement with the al-Sharaa regime. So I guess from that broader perspective, what ability is there, what likelihood is there that the outside world more generally, not just Israel and the Druze, can shape al-Sharaa's incentives to do a lot of things you talked about in your earlier response? We can avoid further things like this, but also have partner is the wrong word, but have a government in Syria that at least helps prevent Iran from reconstituting, ISIL from reconstituting, things like that.
Sure. So, I think that the U.S. is, for the moment anyway, all in on trying to work with the Sharaa government to stabilize Syria. And as I mentioned, the events of the last few weeks indicate that's going to be very, very difficult. And of course, we have a looming issue concerning northeast Syria, where the Syrian Democratic Forces, which work with the United States to suppress ISIS, they are also in their own negotiations with Damascus. So I think that the U.S. has an ability they have front-loaded many of the carrots in the form of sanctions relief, which is an unbelievable opportunity for the Sharaa government to go in a different direction and to cut a deal with Druze and with Kurds and others in the country that's viable, that can bring all Syrians together into a stable political entity. But we just don't see that so far. And I think that's a real cause for pause. I'm not so much of a skeptic. I'm just trying to be realistic in the sense that we want to make sure that, the people I'm from Western Pennsylvania, the people in my hometown who voted for President Trump, they are sick of plowing good money after bad into the Middle East and coming up with horrible results. It's as simple as that. And their sons and daughters dying in the military, right? They want to go. They want. It's not so much about isolationism. They want policy that makes sense and that does well for America and its allies. And in Syria, it's a very tricky situation. It's, as General Amador said, it's a very important central, sort of, it's the row house in the middle of the block. And what happens in Syria, as we know from the war, doesn't stay in Syria. And there are a lot of interests there. I think the U.S. is trying its best. But Syria has been throughout the 20th century one of the world's most unstable countries. It has these tensions for its own reasons, not all of which, by the way, are sectarian. And so that's overcoming all of that is going to be interesting. Syrians suffered, though, together during some horrible slaughter during the course of the Syrian civil war. And sometimes such wars and such slaughter can bring people together. Unfortunately, the events of the last couple of weeks don't indicate that those lessons have been fully learned, but there's still hope with good diplomacy, leadership, and the involvement of U.S. regional allies.
Great, thank you. We have one late arriving question from our audience. I want to sneak it in before the buzzer and pose it to you, Alex. In 30 seconds, how united are the Syrian Druze in their support for close relations with Israel?
The surface, they're a little bit fragmented. Below the surface are very united. I don't know if that's less than 30 seconds. And again, and I say it one more time, they're united to belong to a nation that's stable, that has a future, that's peaceful, that appreciates their contribution to its success.
I think that's a great note to end on. I'd like to thank all of our audience for joining us for this webinar, and thanks to my panelists for joining as well. It was great to hear from your different perspectives. As a reminder to everyone in the audience, JINSA has a paper on these issues coming out next week, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I'd also like to thank General Elian and Kogat for sending their video remarks as well. Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again soon on another JINSA webinar. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much.